Happy to talk. As I said earlier, I was going to talk about two topics. I've already talked about Rohingyas, who are refugees from Myanmar and Bangladesh. This is more about a minority in Bangladesh and a violent attack on them. And this refers to the destruction of the Ramu temples in 2012. And the kind of cross-cutting religious and ethnic conflicts that particular event brought to the fore. Obviously, it's not going to be possible to do a full academic analysis in this short period. So I will simply tell a story and then make some remarks, reflective remarks on it. And if there is time for discussion, perhaps we can go into depth. So this is based on I did some field work in Ramu and Ukhiya, which are the two upazilas where destruction of Buddhist temples took place in September 2012. So I will discuss some of the events which led to the destruction of the temples, how the evidence was collected, how the interviews were conducted, and I'll draw out some inferences on that basis. So this is the area we're talking about. As I said earlier, this is the Chittagong hill tracts, this border, and this is the Myanmar international border. Now, between the Chittagong hill tracts and the Rohingya refugees and Cox's Bazar is the upazila of Ramu. So as I said, this is in the buffer zone between these two major conflicts in southeastern Bangladesh. And this is where this destruction took place. I will try and explain why it happened in terms of factors from both the sources of conflict that I've pointed out here. Now this region has a lot of Buddhists. This shot is taken from Bandarban, which is a bit to the north of the area that I'm talking about. But you see, this is a typical everyday scene. Buddhist monks have come out to collect alms in the morning. But just contrast that with this image of Buddha, which, as you can see, there's a lot of burnt material here, and the face has been damaged, the body has been damaged. And this was done with fire and also the use of shovels and various kinds of iron and concrete implements. This is the burning of one of the temples in Ramu. I think this is the temple which is known as Lalching. After it was burnt, this is what was left. So you can see Lord Buddha unperturbed by the violence and looking at the world despite the ashes and the shambles at his feet. So, having shown you some shots, sort of visual images, let's go back to the story. What happened on the ground? What is it that caused this? First of all, there was a manipulation of a tagged picture on a Facebook account, which belonged to a Buddhist youth called Uttam Burwa. And it showed somebody's foot. The face is not shown, but somebody's foot on the Holy Quran, on the Quran Sharif. And so obviously this was something that would be very obnoxious and very unacceptable to Muslims and would make Muslims very angry. And this is exactly what happened. But somebody discovered this in Ramu Bazaar, printed it out, made lots of copies and distributed it to the bazaar. Now, it's hard to think that all of this happened quite by chance. Later on, it was discovered that this Facebook account from which it was sent, Insult Allah, it was called, was a fake account. It was done, the actual thing had been done 11 days ago, but it was happened to be discovered on the 30th of September. And then, as you will see, there are other elements of what happened which suggest that this was premeditated. So once these printouts of the picture of the fort on the Quran Sharif was distributed to the bazaar. Anti-Buddhist demonstrations began almost immediately. So this is happening around 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So within an hour or two, you have masses of people very furious and saying that we'll skin the Buddhists alive and we'll give them a lesson and everything. And this then leads to the destruction of the temples by Bengali Muslim mobs. Anyhow, both the ruling Awami League party and the Jamaat Islami and the BNP party cadres are involved in this, but significantly, the local Awami League, the area is an Awami League area, and the local Awami League leaders gave the leadership to the processions and demonstrations. They were joined by the Upazila administration and the local police, the OC also, who said if I were not wearing a uniform, I would join the mobs as well. This is the OC is quoted as saying this. So what we have is what these facts suggest is that there was premeditated planning and coordination, and very interestingly, the rumors inflated like a Chinese whispers. So the first story was, somebody spoke of the Quran Sharif. Then the next story was not one person, but Uttam Guru and 10 of his friends with their feet on it, and so on. The story became more and more lurid, and it radiated out of Ramu. What is interesting is the temples that were burned were like a concentric circle. So this is Ramu, the next temple is there, the next temple is there, and it goes out and out spatially out of Ramu, and at successive points in time. So 1 hour after the first one, the next one is burned, and the next one is burned, and this goes on for about 36 hours, and it spreads to the next Upazila. So this is the whole sequence of events over space and time, and the rumors, the way the rumors got exaggerated suggests that, this was not entirely accidental. It defies the laws of probability if it were to be so. Now, what were the features of the violence? There was only damage to temples and homesteads. There was no rioting, there was no killing. There were some manhandling and some scuffles, but it stopped at that point. What is very interesting is there were, if about 20 temples were destroyed, in each one of them, the equipment which was used was similar. So concrete blocks, shovels, inflammable powders, which some people said was barut, but I was told later that it was some kind of chemical, it was not gunpowder, and petrol being used. So it seemed like a very organized attempt. If you think of the army undertaking operations, the army has its standard equipment, it has its guns, it has its bullets, it has its explosives. So this was almost like a standard issue, except that it was not the army, it was some other group. Now the question is who were these groups? And it happened according to an unfolding sequence in space and time. As I said, if the first Lalshing is set on fire at midnight, Shima Bihar is set on fire at 1 o'clock, the Buddha Mukti is set on fire around 2 o'clock, and it goes on. So attacks with virtually military precision. Now what was the role of the administration and security forces? Very interesting. They were never there when the actual attacks took place, or they arrived just after the place had been put on fire. And at least in some cases, we've got video evidence, which I don't have time to show you today, showing that the mob which goes on to burn the next temple is walking in front of a group of police officers. It's not as if the police aren't there. They are there, their vehicles are there. So, and even if there was some element of surprise in the sense of the first temple being burned, after the first 3 temples have been burned, there is no element of surprise. The entire administration should have been put on red alert. All the remaining temples should have been guarded. That did not happen. That is why burning and destroying would go on to the next day and the night of the next day. So these are things that we need to try and interpret. What is happening and why is this happening? As I said, attacks continue despite the presence of the police and the border guards, Bangladesh. And the fire service vehicles were stopped en route. They could not go to the point where they were needed to put out the fires. Now, what was the role of the state administration and the government? This was clearly considered inaction by the national government and local administration. I mentioned the local OC of the police, the officer in charge. But Cox's Bazar town, which is 10 miles away, had Boer forces. They did not come. There were army units, border guard units, which could have reached Ramu in 10-15 minutes, not very far away. None of them were there when the temples were burnt. By midnight or 1 o'clock, Dhaka had been informed. The Home Minister's office and the Prime Minister's office had been informed. But there was no order, or at least in effect there was no action by the local administration to stop this. It is therefore very mysterious as to what was going on. No prevention, no preventive, no protective actions were taken. So what this allowed was to enable mob violence to continue. And in sort of analytical terms, what is supposed to be a secular state, Bangladesh according to its constitution, is supposed to be neutral in that sense. How could a supposedly secular state and also a ruling party which claimed to be secular allow this to happen? And of course the accountability of the government and the state. So these questions were raised. Now, I also want to draw your attention to the complexities of this communal conflict, because it was more than the standard communal conflict that we get in Bengal or India from the time of partition. As we know, Hindu-Muslim religious conflicts have been going on from the colonial period. But just next door, in the Chittagong hill tracts, which I showed you on the map, there's been an ethnic and religious communal conflict going on for the last 30 to 40 years. And there, the conflict has been between Muslims and non-Muslims on the one hand, but also between racially and ethnically different groups. So Bengalis versus the Buddhists, who in most cases were ethnically different. There were Upajadis or tribals or indigenous peoples or Adivashis, depending on what terminology is acceptable. So this complexity I want to explore a little more in the next slides. And what this brings forth are contending notions of nationhood, citizenship, secularism, and the underlying considerations of electoral politics and territorial control. Now, the nature of the cross-cutting communal conflicts, religion and ethnicity. The complexity is this. If you look at the Buddhists in this region, they are composed of two groups. There are the Borua Buddhists, who are Bengalis, just like Muslim Bengalis or Hindu Bengalis. They're ethnically the same, but they are Buddhist. And then you have the Rakhine groups, whom we met in the context of the Himalayas, but we also have local Rakhines, who are Buddhist and therefore religiously different, but also ethnically different. They have this sort of Mongoloid appearance. They are more like the people up in the hills and so on. So there are two kinds of fault lines along which conflicts unfolded. Bengali Muslims versus Borua Buddhists, and we can compare that as to Hindu-Muslim riots, except that in this case it was Buddhist-Muslim conflicts, and it was not a riot and it was one-sided. In other words, the Buddhists did not attack the Muslims, it was the Muslims who attacked the Buddhists. And secondly, if you take the Bengali Muslims versus the Rakhine Buddhists, then you have conflicts between two groups which are both religiously and ethnically different. So you have the convergence of two fault lines in this case. And taking the Boruas and the Rakhines together, you have a very complex situation. Now in Bengal, we've had, as I said, communal conflicts in religious terms for many decades. In the Chittagong hill tracts, we've had ethnic conflict for the last 30 to 40 years. But it is in Ramu that we have the coming together of both the communal divide and the ethnic divide in one particular incident. This is the significance of the Ramu events. Now, what are the factors and agencies responsible for temple destruction? Not very surprisingly, the Army League blamed the BNP and the Rohingyas, and the BNP blamed the Army League, and so on. The Buddhists who were the victims, when you asked them, were unable or unwilling to speak out and take risks. They didn't want to say. I mean, they were a minority, they were afraid, they did not want to be, didn't want to get into a situation where reprisals would be taken against them. But if you look at the underlying motivations and the rationale of the event, certain hypotheses emerge. And this requires us to look at economic and demographic factors and also political, electoral, and communal factors. So let me go through this. The economic and demographic considerations. In the area where the Ramu temples exist, this is the Cox's Bazar area, the first victims have been the Rakhine Buddhists. In the sense that they have been under pressure and intimidation, and they have left the area and they've migrated elsewhere to Burma and other places. And their lands have been taken over by local Bengalis, mostly Muslims but also Hindus. Okay? So the mainstream Bengalis have been taking over the Rakhine Buddhist lands for a long time. And it's not been an explosive event like the burning of the Ramu temples. It was something that happened slowly, gradually, imperceptibly, everyday takeovers. So by the time the Ramu temple destruction occurred, only the Bogla Buddhists were left in the area. The Rakhines had already been pushed out. And the Bogla Buddhists were the guys who had held land in Ramu and the area around it. Because of this incident, I mean, several Bogla Buddhists told me personally, and I'm sure this was repeated elsewhere, that what they said was that they were now beginning to feel insecure about staying in this area. Even though they had not been physically harmed, this was not a communal riot, and in most cases their homesteads were not touched. The fact that their temples had been burned and some homesteads had been damaged had already induced this fear. People were saying, I will sell half of my property and send my wife and children over to India or to England or wherever else they had access. At the same time, what we notice is that there is a rising value of real estate and land grabs in the adjoining coastal belt of the CHT. Let me say a little more about the real estate values. Ramu is 10 miles from Cox's Bazar. Cox's Bazar is a premier tourist resort of Bangladesh. And if you drive from Cox's Bazar down to Tekna, the border of Burma, the entire coastal belt has been taken over by big companies. They've either made constructions or they've put huge notice boards saying this land belongs to such and such corporation. So, first of all, lands have been taken away and the land prices have been going through the ceiling in Cox's Bazar and the adjoining belt. So there's no land left in the coastal stretch. The only land is in the interior, and the first big area that you come from Cox's Bazar to the interior is Ramu. And I also dug up the value of the sale value of land in Ramu from the revenue offices for the period from say about 2003-04 until the incident happened in 2012. And there is a kind of rising curve in the value of land. So it is possible that in the background to these events, whoever perpetrated it and for whatever kind of proximate reasons, a background factor might have been, quite plausibly, that of creating a certain kind of threat and fear so that the Buddhists the remaining Buddhists would leave their lands. And these lands would then become available for whoever could grab them. That is one hypothesis. Secondly, if you look at the political, electoral and communal considerations, neither the Awami League nor the BNP Jamaat are willing to go against dominant Bengali sentiments. And the Buddhist minority are insignificant compared to the Bengali Muslim majority. As one Awami League leader told me personally, it doesn't matter if the Buddhists don't vote. In our calculations, we don't need to take account of that. They're so small. So what we must do at all costs is to keep the support of our Bengali Muslim majority. Reminds you of Aung San Suu Kyi, by the way. That the consideration is the majoritarian vote. Then another factor is also important, which seems to have prepared the ground, and that is the violence on the Rohingyas next door by the Buddhists. What that had done is to create public opinion which is hostile to the Buddhists, and a sense of resentment and anger against Buddhist injustice to Muslims, which kind of required some kind of reprisal. I'm not saying this is rational, I'm trying to interpret what might have happened, the kind of way the mindset might have worked. And certainly this could have been a factor. So this generated anti-Buddhist public opinion among Muslims in Bangladesh, and mutually reinforcing and irreducible elements of communal antagonisms in both Burma and Bangladesh, but mirror images of each other, if you like. This is really repeating the point which I've just gone through, and I don't need to go through the experience of the Rohingya Muslims because I've already spoken about this previously. But the last point here, if you think of the map, which I showed you at the beginning, if I can get back to it. Anyway, I showed the Chittagong hill tracts up north, and I showed you the Burma border down in the south, and I said Ramu is in the buffer zone in between. Well, what is happening is that there are ongoing conflicts in both of these areas. In the Chittagong hill tracts, where a majoritarian Bengali Muslim state has been oppressing Buddhist and other minorities, non-Muslim minorities, on the one hand. On the other, in Burma, you have a Buddhist state, a Buddhist majority oppressing and evicting Muslims, Rohingya Muslims. Those very opposed conflicts have had effects on the buffer zone in between, preeminently in the form of Rohingya refugees, Muslim refugees coming into this zone, into the buffer zone and indeed into the Chittagong hill tracts. So already there is conflict, if you like, between the indigenous peoples of the Chittagong hill tracts and the Rohingyas who are coming in. So basically what is happening is that this whole area, this buffer zone, is getting caught up in the vortex of this conflict as these two conflicts begin to interact more and more with each other. We are living through that process. We've not seen the end of it, and we don't know what the outcome will be. But simply in terms of what has been happening, and I'm talking about events in 2012, we're at the beginning of 2014, so less than a year and a half. And things are not quiet, things are still in convulsion. What are the implications of the Ramu violence and its fallouts? Well, what it has done is put Bengali majoritarianism to the test. Both the Awami League secular variety, and I think we must take Awami League secularism with a pinch of salt, and also the Muslim Bengali nationalism, which is espoused by the BNP and the Jamaat. In both cases, the majority is supposed to protect the minority. In either case. But in this case, we see that the minority is not protected either by the majority or by the state or the government. What are the implications of that for Bengali nationalism, Bengali citizenship, minority rights? Those are the kind of issues which come up. What we see is explicit discrimination against Buddhist minorities by the government and the major political parties of the country. Unequal citizenship rights, despite constitutional provisions. We also see, in terms of complexity, as I discussed earlier, a new and more complex form of communalism. Communalism is not just religious communalism, it can be ethnic communalism, linguistic and cultural communalism. In Bangla, it's not just Dhormiyo Sampradayikota, but also
political communalism. Political communalism.
You could also say that, indeed. Indeed, you could. So basically, and these have implications which I'll come to in a minute. So what it means is we need to redefine what is nationalism and secularism in the context of Bangladesh. For one thing, Bangladesh is a nation state, but it is not composed of only the Bengalis, as has been forced into the constitution, both in the original 1972 constitution and the 15th amendment, which has come up recently. Quite unjustly calls all citizens of Bangladesh Bengalis. That is not true. And it talks about secularism, but it only refers to religious secularism, and it is really addressing Hindu-Muslim conflicts. That is just one conflict. Our conflicts are much more complex. And so for both of those reasons, we need to rethink what is nationalism, what is secularism, and indeed what is democracy in Bangladesh. Whether we're talking about a majoritarian state, are we talking about a pluralistic democracy? All of those issues have been thrown to the fore by the intolerant majoritarianism that we see in Ramu, and also the electoral considerations behind that. Yes, that's it. Thank you. I'll stop it.
We have time for discussion now. You can ask questions and interact. Any questions?
You said that this was seemed as if it was coordinated, hourly burning of temples.
Yes.
It wasn't, because normally mob violence is usually mindless.
That's right.
It's uncoordinated. It
Yes.
happens sort of spontaneously.
Yes.
This looks like very much.
Very much so.
Some people would say that this is sort of, you're be a BNP man, trying to undermine our league. How would you see it? Because what you're saying wouldn't necessarily account with the state government official account of events.
Well, let's come to the answer later on as to who did it, like the detective story. But just to elaborate on what you said, the evidence suggests that if you think of Ramu as the hub of a bicycle wheel, and the spokes are routes, then along almost every spoke, there were lorry loads of people armed with petrol, combustion powders, braking implements, converging on Ramu. From Cox's Bazar, from Idgah in the north, from the east, like Conchuri, from the south. And as I said, this was like standard issue equipment. An enormous amount of money had been invested. Those hiring buses and lorries on this scale costs a lot of money. So first of all, it was that, but also the cost, it was not just the lorry, but the equipment itself had required money. So some groups which had command over considerable wealth had literally invested in this destructive event. Then the question is who would have the motive to do it? My own guess is that there are several, if we think of this as a play or a theatre, then there are several kinds of actors involved here. There are those who actually planned it with a background. But then there were also the people who performed on the foreground. On the foreground, we see the political party cadres of all the major political parties, but led locally by the Awami League, the ruling party. One of the consequences of that was the local police became inoperative. The police saw local army leaders leading the procession, they stopped working. They would not do anything. Now, whether the same argument applies to the border guards and the army, I don't know. I suspect not. They must have received orders. I mean, they would not be simply like the police seeing the army leaders and keeping their distance. In their case, because these are much more organized military or paramilitary forces, they must have been told by some superior somewhere that just keep out of this. It's not your thing, you don't get involved. And the entire state machinery did not get involved until the next morning. The next morning, after about a dozen temples had been destroyed or burned, 2 ministers flew to Ramu and made big speeches about communal harmony and secularism. As they were speaking, another temple was being burnt in India. And it went on even after the ministers left.
This is a customer announcement. Idea Store Whitechapel will be closing in half an hour's time at 5 p.m. If you are using a computer, please be aware they will automatically log off at 4:45. So please print or save your work. Thank you.
So those are the clues. But what theory can you weave together?
For me, I mean, I heard some of this, but you put it in a more coherent way. But I'd also like to say, while you're talking, I just did a Google search to see what was the news reports. News report, one of them said, local people said, followers of an Islamist party, led by several leaders, took out a procession around 10 p.m. And I recall when on the BBC, it said, communal violence, Islamist burning. So, when you said, what is the motive? I mean, successive governments in Bangladesh have played on this, whether it's the BNP and Awami League more so, that there is a extremist radical element within the country which needs to be contained. Whether it's Banglabai or JMB or Tawhidul, I don't know the names now, but there is this always been played, and part of it's to do with getting extra funds from abroad, more strategic alliances, be more important as a government that I'm fighting extremism, so I need to be sort of seen in a better light and given more facilities. And I think this plays into that narrative as well, that there is communal violence. And the BBC, if you look at the BBC report, which I can vaguely remember now, that it was a Muslim Buddhist thing played, a Hindu religious thing played out on the BBC. So it all fits into this, that there is an extremist problem in Bangladesh. And also remember that our government was trying to bring Jamaat Islami leaders to account. So
your interpretation sounds so much like the government line that I am amazed.
No.
That's exactly what the ruling party is trying to say. I think that there is no question that apart from the Awami cadres, Jamaat Islami and Shibir, the student front cadres, were also involved. Certainly one lorry load from Cox's Bazaar was full of Shibir. So it's not the case that they were not involved in it. But having said that,
but I'm talking about the motive, who actually benefited from it.
I'll come to the motive a little later. Let me just go through it. The evidence, I talked with dozens of people, Muslims, Buddhists in the area, in Ramu and in Cox's Bazar. And my impression from first-hand testimonies is this, that yes, the Jamaat and the Islamic so-called extremist groups were involved to some extent, but they were not the dominant players in this event. That is the assessment that I have. Remember that the government, even before any investigation had happened, the government announced that the BNP and the Rohingyas with Islamic extremists had done this, with total silence about the armed cadres who were involved. So there is a state narrative which tries to take the story in that direction, and that story is, this is all done by the enemies of the state, the people who are trying to protect the war criminals and so on. But that narrative, as you know, has been used so often and in so many cases that is very another thing. The evidence does not suggest that that was the case. If if Muslims were involved, then it was not just the extremist Muslims in extremely right-wing parties, but Muslims in Army League and BNP who were also involved. It was certainly Muslim sentiment which had been infuriated by the image of the foot being put on the Quran. At that point, nobody in that mob was thinking, oh, this was fictitious and had been orchestrated by somebody. My case is that, well, I don't want to give an answer like this, but we don't really have time, so...
No, carry on. I'll give you before 5 minutes. We stop here.
I think that behind everything there is a lobby of businessmen who are interested in land. And they have no parties. They belong to Army League, BNP, Jamaat, wherever there is money. And that also includes some Rohingyas who are back from Saudi Arabia with lots of money. So but this is not a party group. This is a class, if you like, a group identified in terms of its class interest, which is that of taking over land and property. But they have planned this event in such a way as that they can remain in the background while creating conditions which will ignite popular sentiment from all the parties. And that is exactly what is achieved through this Facebook tagging thing. I think that the Army League leaders who actually did all the speaking and the marching and so on were not involved in the planning of this. But they thought this was a great chance for them to stand up for being Muslim sentiments, okay, and get some votes. My own interpretation is that the Army League and the BNP were in this for the vote, and for them it is reflective of the cynical treatment of secularism. That what they see is that it's not an issue of principle. They see, will we retain the vote or will we lose the vote if we stand up against this? If we stand up against this and people, our enemies can call us anti-Muslim, then we've lost the votes. So this seems to have been the primary thing. I could be wrong, but I'm trying to give you my own interpretation of what actually happened.
I come from Sylhet, and where I come from, should be Bazar area, there used to be a lot of Hindu landowners who fled to India during the part. Their land has become prime land. Still today, people are fighting over who has control over those land. And I can see that that's something that's played out throughout Bangladesh. And it's, unfortunately, Hindu land is termed as enemy land. That's another problem. You know, in a secular state,
Yes.
how do you call land of Hindu people who fled because of violence enemy land? That actually undermines the whole secularism in Bangladesh. Where successive governments have tried to address that, relabeled that statement. So I agree with you that Bangladesh is not really, you know, when we talk about secularism, it's not really secular. It's just a label, it's just a signboard on the front, but behind that there is no substance. But there's the business people, there's the political sort of aspect of it, which is people have, our Malay government has used that to say there is an extremist problem in Bangladesh, you know, and use that to use it against their opposition parties, specifically in Jamaat Islami, and to sort of roll out this sort of anti-Islam agenda within Bangladesh itself, because this all plays into that there is an extremist element, and then Western powers are more passive.
Sure, that's utilizing this.
Yeah, utilizing it
for other purposes.
That's right. So some of the people, utilize it. They've made the most of it. And it wasn't the last one, because recently there have been similar type of burning of temples, which have been again used to say there is a Jamaat Islam or Islamic groups are.
But all the evidence that one has of these recent ones, before the election and during the majority were done by Army League leaders.
Yeah.
And they wanted the land. And while they did the burning, they proclaimed that this had been done by the BNP and the Jamaat.
But this is also coming across through reading newspapers, so this isn't sort of invisible to the public eye itself. No. They're aware that the Army League and BNP are playing into these, and they're sort of behind sort of the orchestration of these coming conflicts, however you term it, but the religious or ethnic. I'm wondering, given that there's such an apparent lack of political will to deal with these conflicts, how do people, or how does the civil society mobilize against, where is the buffer? What's the buffer between the sort of lack of state, sort of willpower, and sort of in protecting these communities from being the victims of these sort of attacks or such? And because from what I've seen in terms of mobilization, physical mobilization by the civil society, I think it's weak. It's not. You have the odd vigil here and there. You have the sort of the human chain here and there. But then I'm wondering what else is there to be done? How do we sort of mobilize against the face of such powerful state interests, class interests, but also a lack of sort of willpower, not just in terms of the public as well?
That's a very, very good question, to which I don't think any of us have answers. I can just add another question to this, which is that the latest round of events in Bangladesh, with these abductions and extrajudicial killings, that it's in the papers and everything. The same question that you put, who is there to protest against this? What is civil society going to do?
Because you have the same faces coming up and up again, and what I feel like when you have the same, there's a whole normalizing of this, and because these same faces are popping up and up and again, they become less dangerous. You kind of see them and you're like, okay, they're doing their thing, that's fine, and it's really, it's not doing much. So I'm wondering what new ways of, what new strategies of mobilization can be sort of used here. How do you put pressure on the state?
It's a very good point. Why is it sort of the civil society, normal people who don't have a vested interest? But if you look at where this movement could come from, one is the university, or one is the intellectuals or academics, people who are, or your journalists. All of these institutions.
But it is coming from.
No. But if you look at the university, they split down the political, highly politicized institutions now.
Yeah.
Nobody, even from your vice chancellor down to the peon, is with the party. And you see a change of government and a whole change of administration.
Yeah.
So it's highly politicized. Your journalists, regularly journalists who speak out get killed. So and the ones who are allowed to write and have a prominence are either with the political party. So you're looking at the whole society is highly politicized and actually broken into factions. So everybody is looking after their vested interests. So there is no, in that are the common people, and without some leadership from some institution, general people don't come together. That is, you need somebody to bring those, whether it's a union, or whether it's a leading figure, or whether it's the media, somebody has to bring these people together. When all of these people have their own interests and are aligned to the political party, nothing's going to change. Nothing's going to happen.
I don't think there is a satisfactory answer to the question that you posed as to where is this going to come from. But what I can say is that if you look at the history of this country, and sort of popular movements, the anti-Ayub movement, anti-Yahya Khan movements, anti-Irshad movements, it's usually a case of the majority not reacting, suffering in silence, whereas atrocities continue, and they go on until something happens. Like Assad is killed during the anti-Ayub riots, and suddenly that galvanizes tremendous street processions which then don't stop until the fall of Ayub. Same with the Noor Hussein's being shot.
Then we an accident like that. Not frozen, it's an accident.
Well, it was an accident, was it? It could have been an accident, but you see, we don't need the scientific truth here. It's the perception. It's the perception, popular perception, as to what actually happened. And the popular perception was that he had freedom on his back and he was shot because of that.
But should we wait for an accident to happen?
No, I'm not giving any moral.
There should be a process.
I'm not giving a normative. I'm just telling you in terms of what seems to have happened.
Right.
Simply reciting facts from the past. as to how popular movements in Bangladesh suddenly grew up out of nothing. Apparently there is this silence and inaction and nobody is protesting, and suddenly something happens, some precipitating, triggering event happens. And then people come out on the streets and they don't stop until the government is brought down. Now, whether that will happen in this case, I don't know. And I mean, with no basis for prediction, simply by induction.
I mean, the people have been suffering in silence for quite a while. It's not just Ramu, it's what's happening. I mean, these are the recent ones against these sort of encounter killings and disappearances. I'm just wondering what is the trigger? I mean, what the trigger is going to be here? Whether it's just whether I think you're right. Whether one should wait for such an what is the left doing here? What mobilizations happening there? I mean, I have an idea of what the left is doing, but I kind of know that it's a rhetorical question in some senses, but
But you know Bangladesh,
yes.
you say people are suffering, people suffer, but at the same time, people are getting by. And as long as people get by, and people can, and the rickshaw gets his 100 Dhaka a day, can go home and feed his family, you won't see the riots, you won't see mass rebellion and sort of people coming out and trying. It won't happen because Bangladesh, people are getting by. It is an appalling state of affairs in Bangladesh, a dysfunctional state. Politics being played out daily on the streets. But people are getting by. If you read the Economist magazine, there's growth in Bangladesh. In all of this, there is growth, but not from any government plan, but it's just the people themselves taking the initiative and money coming in from abroad and actually keeping the state alive. Otherwise, it would have collapsed a long time ago. So,
I mean, economic growth and inequality, I mean, there's still high levels of
people
inequality.
get by. It's people
Go
get
on
by.
economic growth alone.
But it's that point, it's that threshold after which people rebel. Where is that threshold? Well, as long as people are feeding themselves, they have relative security, they can get by, have their weddings and parties and work and live, and meet. I think that we rarely hit that threshold, and until that threshold is hit, it's not going to happen. I mean, I agree with that. In history, if you look back, the Arab
I don't
Spring.
think that threshold was there in 68, 66. I mean,
Arab Spring, well, there was no movement. You could look in Syria, and I've been to Syria twice, and you talk to people, they say there is no movement here. Everybody's monitored. But there was a latent rebellion, latent sort of uprising, sitting, waiting for the moment for it to happen, and immediately trigger. So Bangladesh could be the same. There is this frustration, but the trigger is required, and when that's going to happen is anyone's guess.
Sure.
There's one question from this
Sorry,
gentleman.
just too late. Just wanted to thank you for a wonderful presentation, though it's very brief. You just draw that kind of...
Could you just introduce yourself, please? Sorry. Just your name, please.
Oh, my name is Mukul Ahmed. That the corporate muscle, how it's
Yes.
kind of building. Rarely people focus into that. It's mostly played that, okay, two parties or Janati, whatever. But I think that that's a fantastic kind of, I mean, the way you raised it, I think we have to think it, that how money is playing the fundamental role, building not only Bangladesh, I'm sure that you are, as a social scientist, that what is happening in all over the world now at the moment. I just, it reminds when you talked about your somebody from our league told you about the vote.
Yes.
It reminds me that I'm sure, write me if I'm wrong, that is it B.N. Paul when he wrote his memoirs about Nehru. Nehru talked about the annexation of Kashmir, that look, democracy can wait.
Yes.
So it reminds me of that same kind of pattern that under the veil of democracy and secularism, how people can behave. Anyway, it's interesting you also raised the question of Army League model of secularism. Is it the constitution has been amended, isn't it, that is saying that Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim is the now been
Reinstated.
Yeah, so is it a secular state under Army League government? That's
a very good question.
First number.
It's
do they go together? That's number one. Also, you said that the BNP is propagating Bengali nationalism or Bangladeshi. That is
Bangladeshi nationalism, I think, but meaning Bengali Muslim
nationalism.
Led.
Later on, last 5 years, we don't hear much about that. Possibly that's died.
Last 5 years they have not.
They cannot sell it anymore, maybe, yeah. I just, maybe I'll take your mail, and I was trying to kind of research that until 1918, Cox's Bazar was under the Burmese rule, as if I'm right.
1918.
1918 was it under, because that is the, before the McMahon line. I think that, is it all the demarcation of Nagaland, Mizoram, Cox's Bazar, Ramu, that belt, is it kind of, yes, all three parties or two parties, they have decided
I don't
to
think this
say...
is under the McMahon line.
No, I'm saying that before that, I think that until 1918 it was part of, or 1818, I may be wrong, the British, they just annexed it very kind of quickly. So, if tomorrow the Myanmaris, they said that, look, this is part of, actually there was, it's a disputed land, how Bangladesh is going to...
They could raise a McMahon line type of argument.
And just wanted to kind of update it, that was anybody kind of tried or brought to justice because who basically attacked the...
No.
Not a single.
No serious attempt. All the inquiry committee reports have not been published. Hundreds have been arrested, but these are cases where a case is registered, but nobody is named. But a number like 1,000 or 500 is given, and that gives the police the license to arrest anybody and extort money.
Okay.
I said, well,
Yeah.
in this case, Repta Banichu.
Sure.
That has been very successful.
Interesting, I was that time in Potia, I was
You
doing
were.
a project here, and it's very, I have to be very careful what I'm saying. And Burua was working with me. Only few families left, isn't it? Mostly some of them are in Yangon also, they migrated, a lot of them, the Buruas.
The Buddhist, you find lots of Buddhas in Chittagong
Okay.
town.
And he was saying that the local, the army kind of camp or whatever, they said, look, we knew the news through our agents.
Okay.
We didn't have any order, we are ready to protect you.
Yes.
But we didn't get a single kind of signal. That is very interesting.
That is very, very
As a kind of captain, that's what he told me, that look, they said that their agents, the DGFI, whatever Bangladesh, much kind of feared, isn't it, like ISI or whatever, they informed that, look, this is a mob is kind of building up.
Yes.
But they just, the administration assumed...
I think that's very believable, very plausible,
Okay.
because there's no way, I mean, in this day where everybody has a mobile, there's
Yeah.
no way this could have not been known to the army command and the DGFI, and indeed the Prime Minister and the cabinet. Everybody knew.
Sure.
But what you say suggests something that I was trying to hypothesize, that the military and the paramilitary had been told to keep off by somebody, whoever that somebody is. And which again suggests that there is state complicity. Also, the paramilitary nature of the operation suggests that even if the actual forces were not used, the planning benefited from military or paramilitary advice.
Thank you.